how to take a very transparent look into the inductive Bible study method. And if you're anything like me, you might have heard that word and just rolled your eyes because you've probably heard all across different ministries and platforms that we are supposed to learn how to inductively study the Bible, but we don't really know what that means. Maybe we hear the terms like observation, interpretation, application, but that just blows right over our head. Or maybe it doesn't, and maybe that does help you. What I want to offer you today is my personal transparent look into what I believe are the nitty-gritty points within observation, interpretation, and application, and how I approach a very heavy breakdown study of the text. So thanks for joining me today, and I hope that this proves helpful for you. So what you're going to see here is we're going to go through kind of like 2 steps when I sit down to study the Bible. So there's an overview and a verse by verse. So a quick note is that I want to urge you to always to read a book of the Bible in its entirety. So don't get in this habit of hopping around from scripture to scripture and only studying like sections. You can do that, especially if you are maybe a believer that is a little bit more familiar with the Bible and you have a little bit more doctrine or foundation that can keep you in the context. But if you're someone who is newer to the Bible and you don't have that foundation, I would really encourage you to not only read a book from the beginning to end, but to also consider reading it chronologically in a whole year if you can, so you can get this a big 10,000 foot overview of what the entire narrative of the Bible is. And so I wanted to start with that. So what I do is study a whole book at a time. So when I sit down to start that, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a book overview. So if you have any good study Bible, then it's going to help you with this at the very beginning of whatever book you're going to read. It's going to break down some of the things that we're going to talk about in here. But what an overview does is essentially it keeps you focused on the context. So this is to help make sure that you are not going to read or approach that book of the Bible outside of what the intended meaning is. And so you've probably heard people, probably myself, talk about context before because it is really important. It's important for us to realize that the Bible is literature, and that means that every book has a very specific author written to a very specific audience for a very specific meaning. And so when we do talk about Bible study, what we should believe in the inerrancy of the Bible is that there's one meaning in multiple applications. So one meaning can be applied very differently to all of our lives. But we want to make sure that we are pursuing right understanding of that one meaning. Now, we could get into a whole discussion on what the right meaning is, because obviously there are different denominations out there, and there are certain divisions in the church, and so that's just a whole nother conversation for another time if you want to dive into that. But just in general, the idea still is, regardless of where you're at, that you believe that there is one meaning to the text in multiple applications. And so that's kind of what this overview is going to do for us. It's going to set us up to rightly understand the book that we are about to approach, gives us the history and the background to what's going on. And so let's look into what this overview is going to cover, okay? So the first thing that we're going to do is we're just going to simply look at the author and the recipients. So this is asking the question, who is the author? Who is writing? What do we know about him? Do we know anything about his story, maybe his profession, or just anything like that, his relationship with God, where he's at with that? And then who is he writing to? What are maybe current circumstances or struggles that are going on with the recipients? Are there certain beliefs or false beliefs or no beliefs? What's going on there? Also, what is the purpose of the book? What is the purpose for writing? A lot of times there is going to be a very specific thing that beginning part of in your study Bible will help tell you this is the reason for, let's say, Paul writing to the church at Corinth. And so we want to map that stuff out, okay? So the other thing that we're going to look at is we're going to look at history. We're going to look at background, what's going on, what's significant about the cities, the places, the towns that we need to know about will affect the way that we're going to read. What are the cultures at the time? A cultural lens is something huge. That is a big gap that sometimes we have to bridge in order to help us understand and apply it to the modern world and to the modern life. So what's going on in culture? What is the historicity of that town and of that place? Are there certain idols in place? Are there certain beliefs in place? Also, are there any political rifts that we need to know about? What is happening politically at the time? That can be huge in understanding, especially in the New Testament, what's going on between the leaders and the opponents of, again, just to continue with Paul, and what that looks like. And so another big thing under history can be looking at the metanarrative. Oh, that's not how you say that. That's misspelled. Sorry about that. The metanarrative. So if you haven't heard about this, basically there are, what I believe, how I look at the metanarrative is 5 distinct parts to the Bible. And so you have creation, the fall, anticipation, redemption, restoration. And so basically we read the Bible through those 5 lenses. It helps us be able to figure out and point us to Jesus when we're reading the text. So for instance, if we are reading in the Old Testament in the part of anticipation, so the creation already happened, the fall already happened, and now we're in this part of history where we are waiting for the coming Messiah. We are waiting for that fulfilled prophecy. We are waiting for the grace of Jesus Christ. So that is going to affect the way then that we read all the events that happen in this season of anticipation. And then same thing. So then if we are then reading from the lens in the New Testament after Christ has already come, died, was buried, resurrected, that then also affects the way that we read and apply what is going on at that time in the Bible. And so we're asking yourselves, what book are you reading? Where does that fall in the meta-narrative of Scripture? And how does that affect the way that we live? It helps us see Jesus and helps us see God's greater plan, this big narrative. It helps us see how he has written a story and is writing a story, and it just also just makes it really, really neat to see. Okay, so then the next one we're going to look at is we're going to look at themes. We're going to do repetitions and even questions. Okay, so are there big overarching themes in this book of the Bible? Are there things, beliefs, doctrines, characteristics that are being repeated throughout the book that we can look for? Are there any specific interpretive questions or applicable questions that we can be thinking through and looking for as we're reading this book of the Bible? So again, a good study Bible will help you with this. It'll kind of lay out some of these maybe challenging questions that over time people have really wrestled with, or show through, will help point that out for you, so that way you can be looking for those and dive into those yourself. So repetition, themes, stuff like that, we're going to map that out and prep ourselves for that so we can be looking for it. And so finally, where is God? So what, like 10,000 foot overview, what does this book of the Bible tell us about God? And when I say God, I'm talking about our Trinitarian God. So I'm talking about the Father, Son, and Spirit. So what's happening in this book of the Bible that is teaching us about who God is? So again, setting that out beforehand, before diving into verse by verse study, is just going to prep you for seeing the correct meaning of the text, what the author was intending to write, what for, and to help kind of see through even the lens of the recipients, and then that way you can accurately apply. Okay, so that is essentially a book overview. Now, you might be asking me, well, Amy, if there's a book overview at the beginning of a book in a study Bible, why are we doing it this way? There's power in writing things down, guys. So when you are actually taking pen to paper, you are physically writing out this information. It is going to help you remember it and internalize it for when you are actually studying it. And besides, there is typically a lot of information in those book overviews. You don't have to go into as much detail as that. Pull out the things that you are going to want to focus on that maybe you don't know and you want to dive into more, and just grab some of that 10,000 foot overview information to hold on to as you're reading to set you up. And so they're physically writing this down and having that as a reference is really, really huge. And besides, too, you're not going to only just want to rely, if you have time, you don't want to just rely on what's in your study Bible, but look at other sources. You can look at free things online like Bible Gateway, Blue Letter Bible, just Googling in general different commentaries online, different trusted resources like Desiring God or the Gospel Coalition, places like that will have some information like this for you that you can add on to basically your information sheet in order to do that. Okay, so overview. Before we move from the overview over to exegesis, verse by verse studying, I really want to talk for a minute about repetitive reading. So I'm just going to write reading and circle it. So to help us really get familiar with the story, with this particular book that we are reading, we want to read it repetitively. And so after you do this overview and you've prepped yourself for what this is about, I want to encourage you to read that book from beginning to end in one sitting. No taking notes, not doing anything, just sitting down and reading it as literature from beginning to end, because what that does is it contextualizes everything that you just read. Or everything that you just wrote down in this book overview. So you're going to be able to take that information that is super fresh and be able to read the whole storyline of that book, and be able to see a lot of this stuff play out. Because here's the thing too, it helps to know what might come later. That might help you understand what does happen in chapters 1 and 2. It might help you better interpret it and observe it by knowing what's happening over here. And so just like when you sit down to read an entire novel and stuff, by the time obviously you're done reading it all the way through, you have a better understanding of the entire story. So similar, since we are studying the Bible, if you read it from start to finish in one whole setting, it'll help give you this overall understanding of what the book is doing. And so that's what I want to encourage you to do. So do that first, read the whole book in one sitting, and then come over to start the verse by verse studying. And so verse by verse studying, I typically will I'll do a chunk at a time. So I'll do anywhere on average maybe between like 7 to 10 verses, maybe an entire chapter, or one big themed section at a time. And then everything that I'm going to talk to you about that goes under verse by verse studying is something that I do throughout an entire week. So this is not something that I sit down and do in one sitting. You can. However, it's going to take a really long time, and two, there's something good about letting your mind refresh. So sitting on it, resting, going to sleep, coming back in a day or two, and reading through it again, and coming up with new notes, because we need to clear our mind sometimes, take a break, and return to the text, and we're going to gather some more things. And so 7 to 10 verses at a time, roughly, whole chapter, big chunk like that, to work through an entire week, and you're going to do these things when you do that, okay? Okay, so the first thing that you do when you sit down to start studying that section, or that I do, is I look at words and phrases. So this is words that maybe I don't know, or phrases that I don't understand and I want to look up the definition to, or words and phrases that I think I know all too well. So now I want to make sure that the definition that I have been believing and using this entire time is actually accurate. And also with that, there's certain words that could have different angles to it. So for instance, an example of this could be righteousness. So in general, broadly, righteousness essentially means justified. But let's say you're reading about righteousness in Romans chapter 6. Paul is talking about righteousness in that section as righteous obedience. So that is a very specific angle on the term righteousness and what that means. And so we want to make sure that we're seeing words and phrases being used from the right angle. And so maybe things that jump out at you, what words, phrases do you need to look into or double check that you understand? And so some of the questions that you can ask about what words and phrases that you want to pull out are things like, are there certain words and phrases that seem to be very bound to the historical context of that book and that you want to look up? Are there certain words or phrases that maybe need to be understood in the original Greek or Hebrew language, and you're going to use one of the free tools to look up what that original meaning is? Are there certain words, phrases that seem to be bound to scripture that maybe, so something like righteousness that isn't necessarily ever used outside of scripture but is literally like a scriptural word, and so looking up that type of stuff. Anything that you, again, just don't know. Is there a word or phrase that seems to be really pertinent to the meaning or the purpose of the book, which is why this is helpful to know beforehand, because if you know of a really big overarching theme or maybe something that is super repetitive and you notice it in that section that you're reading, you're going to want to pull that out and dive into that. And so those are some of the things that you can look for. Something within words and phrases that you might not necessarily like write down in your journal or on a page, but you're going to want to pay attention to is transitional words. So things like therefore or but, You're going to want to circle those, underline those, because it's going to help you pay attention to the flow of thought. Because again, remember, this is literature, so there's a reason for it being written the way it is. And so when we take verses out of context, sometimes we're missing those transitional words, where because if we start a section and it begins with a transitional word, we need to know, like, so for instance, therefore, we want to know what the therefore is referring to. So what's happening in the preceding verses in the section that we need to remember or know in order to understand correctly what this particular section is talking about. So transitional words are really important. So I'll write that down. So you're going to want to pay attention to those. And so the next thing that I'm going to look at is theology, which is essentially the study of the character of God. And so anything that pertains to who God is. So that's kind of where it comes down to this as well. So where is it talking about the Father, Son, or Spirit? That I want to write questions down or thoughts down or anything like that. But also within theology, I kind of look at three big things. So I look at covenant relationships, I look at the narrative, and I look at themes. So this just helps my mind. This is really, really nitpicky, it might seem like to you, but this just helps me define kind of some of the things that I am looking for. And so we're looking for anything regarding the Father, Son, and Spirit, who God is, but then this also helps me. So is there something very specific to the covenantal relationship that God has with his people? And so this is something that if you're not familiar with, I would encourage you to look up. There are multiple covenants within the Bible. However, the big overarching thing that you need to understand with the covenant is that the Old Testament is the Old Covenant and the New Testament is the New Covenant. And so what that essentially means is what Jesus Christ came to do, and what his grace meant, what the cross was, and things like that. And so I'm paying attention to that covenant relationship that God has with his people. The narrative, so this we already talked about, is the meta-narrative over here. So reminding myself in this section of scripture, if there's something that's coming up and I need to remind myself, okay, this is happening in the restoration part, or this is happening in the anticipation part. I need to remind myself that and maybe write some thoughts down or questions that I have down that pertains to the narrative. Okay, and then themes. So Bible is saturated with themes. So in this particular section, am I seeing a theme that comes in line with the big theme of the book, or am I seeing something else and I want to dive into that? So so that's kind of what I do next or throughout as I'm doing that. There's kind of not, you don't necessarily have to do this in order. This is just kind of the way my mind works. So I'm just showing you the different things that I look at, okay? So that's theology. So the other thing that I'm going to do is references. Or another way to say this is just connections. And so again, a good study Bible will give you references to other parts of scripture. So a really great habit to get into is defending scripture with scripture. So before going to commentaries, go to other parts of scripture. So maybe this is where you're going to go back to some of the words or phrases that maybe you didn't understand or you wanted to look up more. Look at those cross references and it'll shoot you over to another part of the Bible that might help give you some greater context and understanding to something that is happening here. And you might be able to start piecing some of this together, because it might shoot you to something where it'll explain the narrative or it'll explain the covenant. And so you want to look at those references and help in your mind connect everything that is going on. But another way to say that is connections, right? And so you don't necessarily need to feel like for every verse in those 7 to 10 verses you need to look up a cross reference, but you're looking specifically for connections to the whole narrative, to the whole Bible, because that'll help you, one, just be in awe of the Father and what he has done in writing his story and inviting us into his story. And this is a really, really good habit to get into because it really shows you some characteristics about God that you can praise him for and worship him for. And so references, connections, okay? So I guess there is kind of an order. You want to do all of these things before you do things like summarizing and applying, because this is what is called observation and interpretation. So this is, you're looking at the text and you're trying to essentially break it down to then put it back together to see that understanding, that one meaning that we talked about in order to rightly apply it. So you're going to do kind of these things first, make your notes, write down your questions, things like that. And then what I want you to do is I want you to summarize. I want you to write a summary. So basically, in that section, those 7 to 10 verses, based on everything that you wrote here, what is a summary? How would you summarize what happens there? And just write that out. Try to summarize that in your own word. And then in your own words. And then after you do that, then you apply. Because again, there's one meaning, multiple applications. So make sure we do the summarizing first, making sure we are figuring out where Jesus is in the text, asking ourselves what God is doing and what we're learning about God first, and then based on that, then we are going to apply it to our modern day life, into our current circumstances now. Asking ourselves the questions, okay, like what am I learning here? What did I just learn about God that I need to take and I need to apply into my life? And what am I going to do about that? So that's where we're going to apply. And so I like what Jen Wilkins says here is that the Bible and Bible interpretation, our Bible study does not neglect self-knowledge, but it puts self-knowledge in the proper place, which is underneath biblical knowledge and knowledge of God. And so we are never going to neglect self-knowledge. If we are ever leaving Bible study and not applying it to our lives, then we are doing something wrong, because the whole point is transformation, and to take what we're learning in our Bible study and going and living it out and implementing it in our community and in our lives and things like that. So we always do want to apply. We just want to make sure that we are first and foremost seeing Jesus and understanding who God is and what he was trying to do within that. And so one last thing that I want to point out that kind of encompasses all of this, it's questions. So, what I want to encourage you on with this, so I do all of this first before I try to do all of that without looking at commentaries first. After I wrestle and after I ask my questions, if I have time, then I will go and look at some commentaries and flesh out my thoughts. But the thing that I want to encourage you to do is to learn how to ask questions and to ask interpretive questions. So it can be as specific as, why did he use this word here? Or why didn't he say this also? And that might not make sense, that might be broad, but it's learning to write questions down and being okay with not answering them in that moment, and being okay with realizing that maybe in a year from now, I'm gonna figure out the answer to that question. Or just in general, maybe I will come back to it. But we have to be okay with not, and realizing that as we continue to faithfully show up and study the Bible, more and more things are going to be answered. But the idea is to ask questions, to be a student of the Word. And so as we are reading, paying really close attention to why the author is writing the way that he is, and then asking the big overarching questions that maybe we won't find out until we're done with the book, or till maybe a year from now when we've lived a certain experience or what have you, whatever it may be. And so, but learn to ask questions as you are studying the text. And so guys, I hope that that is helpful. That is how I break down scripture. I believe that this is like a transparent version into the inductive Bible study method. I hope this invited you a little bit into my mind and into my brain, and how I like to see things and do things. And so I hope it works for you. Let me know if you have any questions. I would love to connect with you further. Leave comments. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. I'm going to continue to do videos like this in hopes that it helps you. And let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time.